From the Gulf States Newsroom, this is the Gulf States Gumbo, your weekly serving of stories from Alabama, Mississippi, and Louisiana. I'm Danny McArthur. I report on the environment and communities, and I'm chopping it up this week. After a New Year's Day attack, veterans worry about stigma.
To have to face the prospect of a public who now maybe is looking at them with fear and distrust. It scares me and it makes me sad.
They weigh in after deadly incidents in New Orleans and Las Vegas. That's all coming up on the Gulf States Gumbo. Two cities, two headlines, two men with army ties. On New Year's Day, deadly incidents in Las Vegas and New Orleans drew national attention to the mental health struggles some veterans face. Gulf States Newsroom reporter Kat Stromquist spoke to veterans in Louisiana about how to make sense of the tragic events.
In mid-January, Jackson Smith and I walked through rows of apartments designed for dozens of veterans in New Orleans. We're meeting some chickens the vets who live here take care of.
Our chicken coop. This pavilion that you see on the right is our edible classroom.
Smith leads this community. I'm here to learn more about what veterans are thinking after a strange and frightening set of headlines. On New Year's Day, two news stories involved their own.
That the Tesla Cybertruck that burst into flames outside of the Trump International Hotel in Vegas.
Following a deadly truck attack on a crowd of people celebrating in New Orleans.
Las Vegas, a suicidal explosion planned by a decorated Green Beret. New Orleans, a devastating truck attack by a U.S. Army veteran who was inspired by ISIS. After the events, Smith, a former Marine Corps officer, saw internet chatter and research papers asking, is something wrong with veterans? That makes him worry about stigma.
To have to face the prospect of a public who now maybe is looking at them with fear and distrust. It scares me and it makes me sad.
Veterans are a huge cross-section of society, more than 15 million people, and Smith says most will never do anything like this. But they do share challenges.
They come out on the other side to a world that they don't know how to belong in, you know?
That feels like alienation and loneliness.
Every single one of us, when we take the uniform off, struggle with that to one degree or another. I know I did.
Like veterans, the New Year's Day events were different. A visible suicide in Las Vegas, an attack meant to kill in New Orleans. An Army Public Affairs office didn't return a request for comment about the events. For some, the Bourbon Street attack sparked an emotional response.
It's very angering, to be honest.
That's Charlton McGinley, a retired Air Force colonel who's now Louisiana's VA secretary. When he thinks of the attack, he returns to the military oath.
That I will support and defend
the Constitution of the United States.
The Constitution of the
He
United
says
States.
it's hard to fathom how the New Orleans attacker betrayed those values.
But you would never think that a domestic terrorist would come from someone who took that same oath that I did. And I think that's what has really troubled me the most.
The New Orleans attacker left the Army years back, and McGinley doesn't know how connected he was to veterans' resources. But from Las Vegas, he says there are big questions.
And makes me wonder if anybody was tracking that we might have a vulnerable soldier here.
Lexi Loudon is a provisional therapist who works with the military community. She says people in these worlds tend to be less shocked when they hear of violent incidents. She says that's because everyone in the service who has sought out mental health care has stories about problems with access.
And it certainly isn't shocking to me because of that recurrent failing.
Loudon is also a military spouse. In her circle, she says there's been a distancing from things like the Bourbon Street attack.
Being like, well, there are these extremists or, mental health just is mishandled.
She says that's understandable.
Individuals don't have the easiest time, putting themselves in the shoes of someone who's going to commit, mass atrocity.
Back at Bastion of the veterans community in New Orleans, a common room hums with activity. Smith and I chat with a staff member setting up a group project.
What are you guys doing here? Lunch?
We are pickling. We're going to pickle these jalapenos and beets so they don't go bad.
Smith connects the New Orleans attack and the Las Vegas suicide to a broader social fraying, linking to systemic problems like school shootings or drug overdose deaths.
this endemic loneliness and disconnection that seems to be happening to everybody everywhere.
He says that hurts veterans and everyone else, and is what this community is trying to solve through interconnected living. For the Gulf States Newsroom, I'm Kat Stromquist in New Orleans.
The Gulf States Newsroom is a team of journalists working with NPR and local public media stations in Alabama, Mississippi, and Louisiana to cover the issues that matter to you. Email us, connect@gulfstatesnewsroom.org.
You're listening to the Gulf States Gumbo. I'm Danny McArthur. Two separate attacks in Las Vegas and New Orleans at the beginning of the year put a spotlight on veterans and the kinds of challenges they face. I'm joined by Gulf States Newsroom reporter Kat Stromquist and Lauren McGaughy of Texas Newsroom to discuss their reporting on veterans communities in Louisiana and Texas. Thanks for joining me.
Hey, Danny.
Hey, thanks for having me.
Kat, let's start with you. You've been looking into the fact that both of these events involve people connected with the military. You visited a veterans residential community in New Orleans and spoke with other former service members from Louisiana and Texas. Can you tell us more about what you learned?
Yeah, so this was interesting because I wasn't quite sure what to expect. Sometimes you go into a story having an idea of what people might say, but I haven't covered veterans issues much at all in the past, and I don't have a personal connection to the service. So much of what these veterans had to say was really novel or surprising to me. As I say in the story, after these sort of shocking events, I found some apprehension from veterans about stigma if people start associating them with these tragedies. But the other side of that, which I'm not really sure comes through in the story, is a little bit of resentment about that possibility. Jackson Smith, the executive director of Bastion, the veterans community I visited, explains that idea here.
And so there are a lot of folks sitting here saying, man, I didn't do this. I didn't have anything to do with it, and I hate it. To the extent that I've ever had anything to do with terrorism, it was signing my life away to go fight it.
The Bourbon Street attack as an act of terrorism came up a lot more than I'd originally anticipated. Like, you heard me in the story talking to the head of Louisiana's Department of Veterans Affairs, whose Air Force career began shortly after 9/11. He pointed out that more than 20 years later, we're still talking about this terrorism.
Lauren, about the man who killed 14 people on Bourbon Street on New Year's Day. I know he was from Houston, and you've been following details about his story closely. How much do we know about him at this point beyond his military service?
We know quite a bit at this point. We know he was born and raised in Texas, so a Texas native. And for the last several years, like you said, he was living in the Houston area. We got some records that showed he had been through a pretty tough divorce in recent years, and he had also failed at some business ventures that he tried to launch in the state. So before the attack, it appears that he was living a pretty solitary life in a largely Muslim area of North Houston.
So you filed records requests to the DOD recently to learn more about this attacker. Why is it important for these records to be made public?
I think obviously at the most basic level, it's helpful for the public to know whether a veteran or really anyone who's accused of a crime had a history of violence or troublesome behavior in the past, in this case while in the service, and how their command dealt with it. Unfortunately, too often we see that these military records aren't made public or that they don't even exist at all. So far, in the case of the New Orleans attacker, the military has denied all of our records requests for disciplinary records. They have used the excuse that there's an open investigation, and so they might hamper the ability to look into the details if they release those records.
These events have revived a conversation around mental health as it relates to veterans. What more did you find in talking with folks in the South about their experiences?
Yeah, like you said, this is something that people have been talking about for a minute. Here's the way one provisional therapist, Lexi Loudon, that I spoke with, put it.
Let me rephrase. Everyone in the military community who has tried to seek mental health care has had a bad experience trying to seek mental health care.
Loudon told me that mental health resources that are available to people who are connected to the service can be years behind the private sector. And that's getting attention, especially in the wake of the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. This one national survey I looked at found that lots of people who served there are now dealing with these challenging issues like depression and alcohol dependence. Now, things are improving. People told me there's less fear nowadays about career consequences for seeking treatment. And there are also some new laws like the Compact Act, which helps provide free emergency care to veterans who are at risk of suicide. But my sense is that it will take a while to sort of right the ship.
Yeah, and I just wanted to add that, from a veteran's perspective, it really does depend what VA you're near and what VA facilities might be within driving distance even. If you're near a massive Veterans Affairs hospital with a really good mental health care system, you're going to have a different access to care than maybe if you live in a rural area and there's not even a facility or a contracted facility within driving distance or within distance of a bus. So, the access to care really does matter regionally where you are and kind of what resources you have available.
How officials in this new presidential administration said they would commit to funding resources for veterans like the ones we've just heard about.
So there is a new VA secretary. That's former Georgia Congressman Doug Collins. He's a veteran himself, Air Force. I didn't cover his confirmation hearings, but the reporting around them says that he has pledged to improve care for veterans. And some groups that have a stake in this, like the Disabled American Veterans Group, have supported him. Now, caveat here that he has a lot of priorities. He's reportedly said some things about cutting regulations and looking at artificial intelligence to modernize processes. So this should be a pretty interesting time for the department.
I know that this is a really heavy topic, and we appreciate your reporting on this. Before we go, let's maybe end this on a lighter note. Our team likes to do something called Gulf States Gems. It's a series where we shine a light on some of the treasures of this region. Lauren, you spent quite a bit of time in the Gulf South. Is there a gem you'd like to share with folks?
There is. I'm actually really excited that I'm about to celebrate my 11th Mardi Gras in New Orleans, 12 overall if you include the canceled one. And I am particularly excited for a group of women who put together a crew where we decorate boots and we have a boozy brunch in the French Quarter and walk around in our decorated boots and just try to manifest positive things for ourselves throughout the year. So very thankful for that group of strong females coming to New Orleans from all over the country for Mardi Gras and celebrating together.
Lauren McGaughy from Texas Newsroom and Kat Stromquist from Gulf States Newsroom, thanks for joining me.
Thanks, all.
You're welcome.
You can see pictures of Gulf States gems from across the region on our Instagram. And we want to hear about a place you consider a gem, a restaurant, a bookstore, or a natural park. Send us your suggestion. Email connect@gulfstatesnewsroom.org. This week's Gulf States Gumbo was hosted by me, Danny McArthur. Our head chef this week is Tyler Pratt. Our theme music is by DJ Supreme. Special thanks to our partner stations WBHM, Mississippi Public Broadcasting, WWNO, and WRKF. You can find us in your podcast feeds every Friday. Look us up and be sure to subscribe. Thanks for listening, and don't forget to stir your roux.